While the world's attention fixates on the escalating military brinkmanship across the broader Middle East, a seemingly bureaucratic move out of Brussels just quietly altered the geopolitical architecture of the region in ways that traditional military posturing cannot. The European Union's unprecedented decision to officially blacklist and sanction extremist Israeli settlers and their organizations in the West Bank is not just a diplomatic slap on the wrist. It represents a fundamental fracture in the long-standing economic firewall protecting Israel from European punitive measures. For months, this motion was paralyzed by internal European vetoes, most notably from Hungary's former government, but the sudden unblocking of this consensus reveals a tectonic shift in European patience regarding the surging violence in the occupied territories. It is highly strategic that the EU paired these measures with simultaneous sanctions against leading Hamas figures, a calculated balancing act attempting to project diplomatic neutrality while finally moving past a long-standing political deadlock. By weaponizing asset freezes and travel bans, the EU has finally crossed the Rubicon, transitioning from endless rhetorical condemnations into tangible legalized economic warfare against specific actors who previously operated largely beyond consequence. Furthermore, it will now become completely illegal for any European entities to conduct business with these blacklisted individuals, a structural move designed by Brussels to pack a severe economic punch. Yet, to understand the true gravity of this maneuver, we must look past the immediate sanctions and examine the profound diplomatic warfare tearing through the halls of Brussels itself. These specific penalties are widely viewed by insiders as the absolute lowest common denominator, a watered-down compromise deliberately designed to pacify deeply entrenched divisions among member states regarding their overall ties to Israel. You have nations like Spain and Ireland aggressively pushing for severe consequences and demanding movement on broader, more punitive trade restrictions. On the other side of this diplomatic rift, Germany, bound by its immense historical sensitivities and deeply complex bilateral relationship with Israel, has fiercely backed these specific individual sanctions, but aggressively blocked any systemic downgrade of broader state-level trade ties. In fact, the diplomatic friction has become so intensely toxic that Luxembourg's foreign minister recently issued a thinly veiled, blistering critique of Berlin, essentially accusing Germany of allowing its history to completely paralyze any meaningful European moral authority on this issue, rendering him speechless. Germany counters that dialogue is vastly superior to isolation and maintains it strongly advocates for a two-state solution. But the friction exposes an EU that is desperately struggling to maintain a unified foreign policy consensus. But the real battleground is not merely about the handful of extremists whose bank accounts will be frozen today. The true center of gravity is the massive, multi-billion-euro trade relationship between Israel and the European Union, which currently stands as Israel's single biggest trading partner. This initial wave of targeted sanctions acts as a highly strategic wedge, fundamentally designed to pry open the door for far more devastating economic mechanisms that are already being discussed behind closed doors. Right now, France and Sweden are quietly drafting proposals to categorically restrict or completely ban the import of all goods produced within illegal Israeli settlements. If that proposal eventually makes its way to the table over the next few weeks and somehow bypasses the usual gridlock, it creates an absolute logistical nightmare for Israeli exporters and introduces severe compliance risks for European corporations operating in the region. Naturally, the Israeli government's reaction has been absolutely explosive, treating this not as an isolated human rights mechanism, but as a deeply coordinated political assault against its sovereignty. Foreign Minister Israel Katz furiously dismissed the entire framework as arbitrary and entirely detached from evidence on the ground, flatly rejecting the foundational premise that these sanctioned settlers committed human rights abuses. Even more aggressively, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who actually co-founded one of the very organizations now caught in the EU's crosshairs, immediately demanded severe institutional retaliation, urging the outright annexation of strategic areas within the occupied West Bank. This exposes a massive geopolitical paradox. These targeted European penalties, designed to deter extremism and hold violent perpetrators accountable, might perversely trigger the very hardline Israeli territorial expansion they sought to prevent. We have seen this exact dynamic play out historically. Whenever international bodies push closer to recognizing Palestinian statehood or curbing settlement activity, Israel often responds by rapidly entrenching its footprint, effectively making the situation on the ground exponentially more difficult. Human rights organizations argue these sanctioned settlers already act with complete impunity, often aided and protected by the Israeli state itself, making these European measures a direct challenge to Israel's internal sovereign security policies. The potential fallout extends far beyond the immediate travel bans. It introduces a chilling effect on global corporate compliance, where international banks and shipping conglomerates may simply choose to overcomply and quietly divest from Israeli regional operations entirely to avoid getting caught in the crossfire of evolving European blacklists. The real risk lies in how key players respond moving forward. If the internal European coalition, spearheaded by France, Spain, and Ireland, manages to eventually override Germany's protective veto and forces a comprehensive restriction on settlement trade, we will witness an unprecedented deterioration of the EU-Israel alliance, ripping apart decades of economic integration. Conversely, if Israeli hardliners utilize this moment to justify the total annexation of the targeted territories, it forces a direct, inescapable confrontation with their largest economic patron, forcing European nations who have historically shielded Jerusalem to either radically capitulate or finally unleash full-scale economic warfare that could target broader Israeli trade relations directly. We are standing at the absolute edge of a fundamental restructuring of international trade leverage and diplomatic immunity, where the bureaucratic stroke of a European pen may ultimately detonate a far larger geopolitical crisis than anticipated. Will this initial breach in Europe's protective firewall ultimately force a total restructuring of Israel's economic reliance on the West, or will it trigger devastating policy blowback by accelerating the permanent annexation of the very territories Europe is attempting to shield?